The ice came down like fists of God, and when it was done, the valley smelled of shattered leaves and ruin. Men stood in their fields and did not speak, looking at the splintered branches of their proud, straight apple trees, at the green and red pulp pounded into the mud. It was the work of 10 minutes to erase the work of a year, and for 100 miles in every direction, the harvest was over before it had begun. The only sound was the drip of water from torn leaves and, later, the quiet sound of a woman weeping. But on the ridge to the west, where the land was poorest and the trees grew like gnarled beggars, a different quiet held. Here, the ground was littered with ice and shredded foliage, but beneath the low, tangled canopy, the fruit hung heavy and whole, dappled with shadow and miraculously safe. 2 years earlier, the place had smelled only of dust and scorn. Eliza May had arrived with one trunk, a deed her father had won in a card game he should have folded, and a silence that the town of Promise took for weakness. The land was 10 acres of rock and thistle on a windswept ridge nobody wanted. Its chief feature was an orchard of some 200 apple trees, planted by a long-gone settler with more optimism than sense. They were not the proud, vase-shaped trees that filled the valley floor, the source of the town's modest wealth. These were twisted, low-growing things, their branches reaching sideways instead of up, forming a dense, almost impenetrable thicket. That's the Blight Orchard, the land agent, Mr. Gable, had told her, a smile of pity playing on his lips. The man who planted it was trying some fool notion from the old country. They never bear right. Too sour, too small. You'd have done better to sleep in the street, the town agreed. They watched her walk the rutted track to her new property, a solitary figure against a vast, indifferent sky. They called it Eliza's Folly. She spent the first week not in the shack that passed for a house, but in the orchard itself, walking every row until the sun fell and the coyotes began their nightly calls. She did not see blight. She saw neglect. She saw trees that had fought tooth and nail to survive on poor soil and too much wind, and in their stubborn, horizontal growth, she felt a strange kinship. Her only neighbor to the north was a man named Sorensen, an old Dane who had a small, immaculate farmstead. He came over on the third day, not with advice or pity, but with a loaf of dark bread and a small crock of butter. He watched her run a calloused hand over the rough bark of a tree. "They say it is a worthless place," she said, her voice quiet. He nodded, his eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. He looked at the low, tangled branches, then at the tall, orderly trees in the valley below, visible even from here. "In my country," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we have a saying, the strong branch bends. The brittle one breaks." He said nothing more, just gave a small nod and left her to her work. Eliza held his words in her mind like a smooth stone. The strong branch bends. She looked at the orchard, at its web of interlocking limbs, and for the first time, she smiled. The first spring was a campaign waged against neglect. Every morning, before the sun had burned the mist from the valley, Eliza was in the orchard. Her hands, already rough from a life of labor, grew as hard as the bark she tended. The town saw her, a small figure moving through the tangled mess, and shook their heads. "She's trying to prune them into shape," one farmer said to another at the mercantile. "Waste of a good saw, but she was not trying to force them into a shape they did not want." Mr. Sorensen's words had taken root in her. She was not fighting the trees, she was listening to them. She saw how the lowest branches, thick as a man's arm, created a shelter from the relentless prairie wind that scoured the ridge. She saw how the dense canopy of leaves, so different from the airy valley orchards, shaded the ground beneath, preserving what little moisture the thin soil held. She did not prune for height. She pruned for health. Day after day, she worked her way through the thicket, her saw and shears her only companions. She cut away the dead wood, the branches that crossed and rubbed each other raw, opening small windows in the canopy to let in the morning light. It was slow, aching work. The arithmetic of survival was a constant hum in her mind. She had enough money for salt, flour, and beans to last 6 months. After that, the land would have to provide. Each cut branch was a question. Was this helping? Was this a waste of precious energy? She banked her small hopes like a coal under ash, refusing to let them die, but refusing to let them burn too brightly and consume her. Her compost pile became her altar. She gathered spoiled hay from Sorensen's barn, kitchen scraps, and wagon loads of manure from the livery in town, a task that earned her fresh waves of mockery. They saw her hauling the stinking refuse and called her the queen of her own dunghill. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the slow, microbial alchemy of decay. She was turning waste into life, rot into soil. She spread the dark, rich humus around the base of each tree, a silent offering. She dug. The ground was a stubborn mix of clay and stone, and her shovel often rang with a sharp protest. But she found that beneath the first few inches, the earth was cooler, damper. The trees had sent their roots wide rather than deep, seeking sustenance where they could find it. She learned their logic, their pattern of survival, and worked with it, not against it. By June, the orchard was transformed. It was still a low, tangled place, but it was a clean tangle. The ground was clear of thistle and scrub, and the trees, freed of their dead weight, seemed to breathe more easily. A fine green haze of new leaves began to fill the spaces she had cleared. She had spoken to almost no one but Mr. Sorensen for months. He would sometimes appear at the edge of the property, watching her work, a quiet approval in his gaze. He never offered advice unless asked, and when he did, it was simple, practical. "They are thirsty," he said one hot afternoon. "But a flood is as bad as a drought. Give them a slow drink." That evening, she began digging shallow trenches, contouring them to the slope of the land, designed to catch and hold what little rain might fall, guiding it to the roots instead of letting it run off the hard-baked clay. It was the work of a beast of burden, but she did it, day after day, until the whole orchard was etched with a network of life-giving veins. One afternoon in early July, a boy appeared at the edge of the orchard. He was perhaps 10 years old, with hair the color of straw and a smattering of freckles across his nose. His name was Finn, the blacksmith's youngest, a boy known for being more curious than was considered proper. He had heard the stories about the madwoman on the ridge, and he had come to see for himself. He watched Eliza from behind a chokecherry bush for an hour as she patiently worked a thick layer of straw mulch around the base of a tree. She moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm that was mesmerizing. She was not frantic, not mad. She was building something. Finally, he stepped out. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice betraying his awe. Eliza, startled, straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove. She looked at the boy, at his wide, guileless eyes, and saw not the town's scorn, but simple wonder. "I'm helping them remember how to grow," she said. It was the truest thing she could think to say. From that day on, Finn was a regular presence. He never announced his arrival, simply appearing at her elbow as she worked. At first, he only watched. Then, he began to help. He was small, but he was quick. He carried buckets of water, pulled the more tender weeds she pointed out, and helped spread the straw that kept the soil cool. He asked endless questions, and Eliza, who had been silent for so long, found herself answering them. "Why do you leave those branches so low?" he'd ask. "Because they protect each other from the wind," she'd reply. "Why are you putting rotten stuff on them?" "It's not rotten," she explained, crumbling the dark compost in her hand. "It's food. It's what's left after everything else is done, and it's the beginning of everything new." He didn't understand it all, but he understood her certainty. He became her shadow, her apprentice, her first and only believer. The town noticed, of course. They saw the blacksmith's boy spending his days up on the ridge. "She's addled the child's mind," they whispered. But Finn's father, a man who understood the slow and patient shaping of stubborn material, saw the purpose that had settled in his son's eyes and did not forbid him from going. Through the furnace blast of August, Eliza and Finn worked. They learned the secret language of the orchard. They knew which trees caught the most morning sun, which ones were most sheltered from the north wind. Eliza began giving the trees names, a private act of christening. There was Goliath, a sprawling giant near the center. The sisters, a trio that grew so close their branches were permanently entwined. And Stubborn, a small tree at the far edge that looked half dead but clung to life with a fierce tenacity. Finn added his own names: the dragon, the octopus, the hidden fort. They were creating a world together, a secret kingdom of gnarled wood and green leaves. What the town saw as a worthless thicket, they saw as a community. The work was changing Eliza. The solitude and the physical exertion were stripping away the timid uncertainty she had arrived with. Her silence was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of focus. Her hands were her testament, crisscrossed with the scars of her labor. Mr. Sorensen saw it. The roots grow strong in hard soil, he remarked one evening, handing her a pail of fresh milk. She just nodded, accepting the gift and the truth behind it. She was taking root herself, in this place everyone else had abandoned. The second spring arrived, and with it came the miracle. The trees, which had produced only a few sparse blossoms the year before, exploded in a riot of pale pink and white. The air on the ridge, usually thin and smelling of dust, was suddenly thick with the sweet, heady perfume of apple blossoms. For 2 weeks, the orchard was a place of breathtaking, almost sacred beauty. Eliza and Finn walked the rows in a state of quiet reverence. It was a promise, made visible. Will they all become apples? Finn asked, his voice a whisper. We'll see, Eliza said, not daring to hope too much. It was one thing to coax leaves from a tree, another entirely to ask for fruit. But as the petals fell like a late snow, tiny green nubs began to form in their place. And they held. Day by day they swelled. The arithmetic in Eliza's head shifted. It was no longer about how many months of flower she had left. It was about the slow, steady multiplication of hope. 197 trees. If each tree produced even 1 bushel of good apples. She refused to finish the calculation. It felt like tempting fate. The apples that grew were not like the perfect, polished orbs from the valley. They were smallish, lopsided, their skin often russet and rough. They were ugly fruit. Mr. Gable drove his wagon up the track one day in late summer, ostensibly to check on her. He walked to the edge of the orchard and peered in. Well, I'll be, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You got some fruit on those things after all. Shame they're not worth picking. Too ugly for market. Too sour for sauce. He picked one from a low-hanging branch, sniffed it with disdain, and tossed it on the ground. Still, a good effort for a woman alone. Eliza said nothing. She watched him drive away, his judgment hanging in the air. That evening, she picked the apple he had discarded. It was still warm from the sun. She wiped the dust from it on her sleeve and took a bite. A burst of flavor exploded in her mouth, intensely sweet, astonishingly complex, with a sharp, clean finish that made her eyes water. It was not sour. It was the most perfect apple she had ever tasted. It was the flavor of sunshine and hard soil, of wind and patience. She sank to the ground, laughing, the juice running down her chin. It had worked. The secret was safe. The trees had bent, they had struggled, and in their gnarled, ugly bodies, they had concentrated all their strength into this small, imperfect, glorious fruit. She did not sell a single apple and promise that year. She and Finn harvested them in secret, basket by basket, storing them in the cool, dark root cellar she had spent a month digging out beneath the shack. They worked in the twilight hours, hidden by the dense canopy. The cellar filled with the rich, winey smell of apples. It was the smell of security. It was the smell of a future. She counted them, basket after basket after basket. Enough to eat, enough to preserve, enough to last the winter, and more. One crisp morning in October, Eliza loaded 3 bushels of her ugliest apples into the back of a small cart she had bought from Sorensen. She covered them with a canvas tarp, hitched up the old mule she'd acquired in a trade for clearing stones, and set off not for Promise, but for the town of Redemption, 30 miles to the east. Redemption was a larger town, a stagecoach stop with a hotel and 2 bakeries. She went to the smaller of the 2, run by a woman named Mrs. Gable, no relation, thankfully, to the land agent, a stern-faced German woman with a reputation for baking the best pies in the county. Eliza carried in a single small basket. A sample, she said, setting it on the counter. Mrs. Gable looked at the lumpy, russet apples with a skeptical eye. These look like windfalls, she said, her voice blunt. I don't buy windfalls, just taste one, Eliza said, her own voice steady. The baker sighed, picked up the smallest of the apples, and took a reluctant bite. Her expression shifted. Her eyes widened slightly. She chewed slowly, thoughtfully. Then she took another, larger bite. She looked from the apple in her hand to Eliza. Where did you get these? She asked, a new respect in her tone. I grew them, Eliza said simply. I have 3 bushels in my cart. More, at home. Mrs. Gable took another apple from the basket and disappeared into the back. She returned a moment later with a small, sharp knife and a cutting board. She sliced the apple into thin wedges, tasting each one. She smelled it. She held a slice up to the light. Finally, she looked at Eliza and nodded. I will buy the 3 bushels, she said, and I will pay you a fair price. This is a true baking apple. The flavor holds. When can you bring more? Eliza felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the ovens. It was the warmth of validation. One person. It only took one person to see the value others had mocked. She sold the 3 bushels for more money than she had seen in 2 years. With it, she bought glass jars for canning, a new blade for her saw, a warm coat for Finn, and a small bag of horehound candies for Mr. Sorensen. The trip became a weekly ritual. Every Tuesday, she would load her cart before dawn and make the long journey to Redemption. Mrs. Gable was always waiting. Her pies, once famous, became legendary. People began to ask about the apples, but the baker was as secretive as Eliza. A private supplier, was all she would say. The money changed things, but slowly, quietly. Eliza bought a few chickens, a milk goat. She mended the roof of the shack. She was still poor, but she was no longer desperate. The arithmetic in her head was no longer about survival, but about investment. How many more trees could she mulch before the first frost? How many jars of apple butter could she put up for the winter? She was banking her success, keeping it hidden from the scornful eyes of promise, letting it grow in the dark like a root. The town saw only that she was still there. They saw the smoke from her chimney, the chickens scratching in the yard. They assumed the old Dane was helping her, that she was living on his charity. The folly, it seemed, was merely enduring. They had no idea it was beginning to thrive. The second harvest was even larger than the first. The trees, now healthy and well-fed, produced with an abundance that astonished her. The root cellar was filled to overflowing. Eliza's weekly trips to Redemption continued, her cart now laden with 5 bushels at a time. The quiet prosperity on the ridge began to be noticed. It was in the new panes of glass in her windows, the sturdy fence she and Finn built for the goat, the way she no longer looked down when she walked through town. Scorn began to curdle into suspicion, and suspicion into envy. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The whispers changed. She wasn't just mad. She was lucky. Or she was hiding something. Mr. Gable was the first to act on the suspicion. He rode up to her property again, this time without the pretense of a neighborly visit. His eyes scanned the new fence, the healthy chickens, the neat stacks of firewood. He did not ask to see the orchard. He already knew. He could smell the faint, sweet scent of apples on the air. I hear you've been making trips to Redemption, he said, his voice smooth as oil. Doing a bit of trading, a bit, Eliza agreed, her hands resting on the handle of the axe she'd been using to split wood. She did not invite him to stay. It's a hard life for a woman alone, he went on, ignoring her coolness. Managing a property like this, dealing with buyers. A person could get cheated, not knowing the proper value of things. He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. I'd be willing to take the whole property off your hands. Give you a fair price. Enough to set you up in a small room in town. Save you all this trouble. I'm not looking to sell, Eliza said. Her voice was level, calm. Every man has his price, Gable said with a dismissive wave. And every woman her limit. Think about it. My offer is generous. He named a figure that was, she knew, perhaps a quarter of what the land was now worth. It was an insult dressed up as charity. The trouble is mine to manage, she said. And I find I'm managing it just fine. For the first time, the mask of condescension slipped from Gable's face. A flicker of cold anger showed in his eyes. He had expected gratitude, or at least weary acceptance. He was not accustomed to being refused, especially by a woman he considered his inferior. He looked past her, at the edge of the tangled orchard, a place he had declared worthless. And he saw the truth. He had been wrong. But a man like Gable does not admit his mistakes. He buries them. A shame, he said, turning his horse. A real shame. A hailstorm, a fire, a blight. This ridge is a hard place. It would be a pity to lose everything for a bit of pride. The threat was as clear as the new glass in her windows. He rode away, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the coming autumn. Eliza stood for a long time, the weight of the axe in her hand a cold comfort. She was no longer just fighting neglect. She was fighting greed. The sky began to change in the third year, near the end of August. The days were still hot, but the air grew heavy, thick with a strange, yellow light. The sunsets were unervingly vivid, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. Mr. Sorensen would stand on his porch in the evenings, looking west, his face etched with a deep worry. "The sky is talking," he told Eliza one afternoon, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I do not like what it is saying." The clouds that gathered were not the soft, billowy clouds of summer rain. They were hard-edged, towering things that climbed miles into the air, their tops flattened like an anvil. They built up each afternoon, promising a storm, but delivered only a few spiteful drops of rain and a rumble of distant thunder before dissolving at dusk. A tension settled over the valley. The farmers watched the sky, their faces tight with anxiety. Their apples were heavy on the branches, just a few weeks from harvest. A good storm could bring welcome rain. The wrong kind of storm could bring ruin. Eliza felt the tension in her bones. She and Finn worked with a quiet urgency, shoring up the chicken coop, securing the goat's pen, ensuring the cellar doors were tight. In the orchard, there was nothing to be done but wait. The trees stood as they always had, their branches bent and interwoven, a low, dense fortress of leaves. One afternoon, the air went completely still. The birds fell silent. The usual hum of insects ceased. A deep, unnatural quiet fell over the land. The sky to the west was the color of a dark slate, and the anvil-shaped cloud was larger and more menacing than any they had seen before. "It's coming," Finn whispered, his eyes wide. "Go home, Finn," Eliza said, her voice gentle but firm. "Be with your family." He hesitated, then ran, his small figure disappearing down the track. Eliza stood alone, watching the storm approach. It did not roll in. It advanced, a solid wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. A low, continuous roar began, a sound that was felt in the chest as much as it was heard. Then came the wind, a sudden, violent gale that tore at her clothes and flattened the tall grasses. She retreated into the small shack, barring the door, and watched through the window. The first hailstones were the size of peas, rattling against the roof. Then they were marbles, then walnuts. The roar grew deafening, a relentless, percussive assault. It sounded as if the sky were being torn to pieces and hurled at the earth. She could hear the sharp crack of branches breaking, the sickening thud of ice punching through the shingles of her roof. The world outside the window dissolved into a churning, white chaos. It was impossible to tell where the sky ended and the earth began. She thought of the orchard, of Goliath and the sisters and stubborn. She thought of the valley, of the proud, upright trees with their heavy burdens of fruit, exposed and vulnerable. The strong branch bends, she thought, her hands clenched into fists. The brittle one breaks. The barrage lasted for 12 minutes that felt like 12 years. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The roar faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of water dripping. Eliza unbarred the door and stepped outside into a world transformed. The air was cold, stripped clean, and it carried the sharp, green scent of pulverized leaves. The ground was white, covered in a thick blanket of hailstones, some as large as a hen's egg. Her small vegetable garden was gone, pounded flat into a green slurry. The shingles on her roof were pocked and splintered, but the shack was still standing. She turned her eyes to the orchard. It was a scene of devastation. The leaves were shredded, ripped to ribbons, giving the entire canopy a tattered, skeletal look. The ground beneath was a carpet of green confetti and melting ice. Her heart sank. It was all for nothing. All the work, all the hope, destroyed in a matter of minutes. She walked forward, her boots crunching on the ice, her movements slow and heavy with dread. She pushed aside a torn branch on the nearest tree, peering into the gloom beneath the canopy. And then she saw it. An apple. And another. And another. They hung from the branches, nestled deep within the protective tangle, their skins pocked here and there with a small bruise, but largely whole. The outer layer of leaves had been sacrificed, acting as a shield, absorbing the worst of the impact. The low, interwoven branches had deflected the blows, creating a living roof that had sheltered the fruit hidden within. The very structure the town had mocked as ugly and worthless had been its salvation. She moved from tree to tree, a growing sense of awe replacing her despair. It was the same everywhere. The leaves were ruined, but the fruit was safe. Not all of it, not perfectly, but the vast majority of her harvest was intact. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she leaned against the trunk of Goliath, her hand flat against its rough, steady bark. It was a miracle born not of chance, but of design. The design of a tree that knew how to survive. Later that day, the news began to trickle up from the valley. It was a catastrophe. The orchards were a total loss. The tall, elegant trees had been stripped bare, their branches shattered, their fruit hammered into the mud. Years of careful pruning to create an open, sun-receptive shape had left them completely exposed to the storm's fury. Mr. Gable's prize-winning orchard, the pride of the county, was a wasteland of splintered wood. There would be no harvest in promise. There would be no apples for the market, no cider for the press, no income for the winter. There was only ruin. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ice-strewn ground, the first visitor arrived. It was one of the farmers who had laughed the loudest at her efforts. He stood at the edge of her property, his hat in his hands, his face pale with shock. He said nothing. He just stared into her tattered but fruit-laden orchard, his eyes filled with a terrible, dawning understanding. The town of Promise fell into a stunned silence. The hailstorm had broken more than just trees. It had broken their spirit. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy confidence, the casual cruelty. Pride is a poor meal when the larder is empty. In the days that followed, a slow pilgrimage began up the winding track to Eliza's folly. They came not to mock, but to see. They stood at the edge of her property, looking at the impossible sight of an orchard full of apples in a valley full of ruin. They looked at Eliza, the woman they had scorned, and saw not a fool, but a prophet. Mr. Gable came, too. He did not come with humility. He drove his wagon up the ridge as if he owned it, his face a mask of cold fury. "You got lucky," he snarled, dispensing with any pleasantries. "That's all." "A fluke, I suppose it was," Eliza said, her voice even. "I'm buying your crop," he announced. "All of it. I'll give you 10 cents a bushel." It was a laughably low price, an insult. In a normal year, apples sold for $1 a bushel. This year, with no other supply for 200 miles, they were worth 10 times that. "They're not for sale," Eliza said. "Not to you," Gable's face darkened. "Don't be a fool, woman. You can't move that much fruit on your own. It'll rot in your cellar. I'm the only one with the connections, the wagons. You'll sell to me, or you'll sell to no one." He took a step closer. "I can make things very difficult for you. A word to the tax man about your undeclared income from redemption. A complaint about the state of your property. One woman alone." "It seems I'm not alone," Eliza said, her gaze shifting to a point just over his shoulder. Gable turned. Mr. Sorensen was there, holding a stout hickory walking stick. And behind him stood Finn's father, the blacksmith, his heavy arms crossed over his chest. And behind him, 2 more farmers from the valley, their faces grim. They had come not to